You're good. Okay, yeah, I'll just use this. All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for coming in person. Thank you for coming in online. Um, I'm just going to make a couple few quick remarks and then pass it over to the main event. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Sabrina Hermosilla. I'm an assistant professor in the Helburn Department of Population and Family Health within the program of Forced Migration and Health, and also co-director of the Care and Protection of Children, CPC Learning Network, that you can see there, you can see online, I hope. And I'm really excited to be here today for this webinar on child protection in the era of localization. And before we get started, this event is co-sponsored by us, CPC, and also the University Seminar on Global Mental Health, so thank you. And for those of you who might be new to the CPC family, I just wanted to give you a little bit about who we are. And so functionally, since 2005, we've really sought to spark critical conversations that challenge how we support children, youth, and families around the world. And you might wonder, well, how do you do that? So we do this across three main strands. One, research and learning. Two, policy and practice guidance. And then three, convening and sharing. And what's so fun about this is I feel like it actually touches on all three of those. So you're in for a treat. And while I get to be here and be the figurehead of something, it's really what makes CPC so amazing and beautiful is the global research partners that we have, one of whom's right here, and we'll be hearing from him later. And anyway, I'm going to get to you in a moment, Mike. So enough about me, enough about the co-sponsors, right? Why are we here, right? So we are here because we know that in this era of localization, there are many challenges, but also really a lot of opportunities of how we can move towards more community-based child protection approaches. And we just are so honored that we have Dr. Mike Wessells presenting his report today on behalf of the work he's done with tons of others, and I know you will correct me, also with Kathleen Costanley, and their amazing work that they've done together. So what are we going to explore here? We are going to explore three main case studies of how they've been able to highlight community-led child protection initiatives, specifically in Sierra Leone, Kenya, and India. And I think we're basically done listening to me talk about this, and we just want to get to the main event. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Mike Wessells. One more minute, you have to bear with me. So we have a formal introduction, but also I just need to say that I took your class many, many years ago. And I just wanted to share this one vignette when I was thinking about today. And so for those who are students or former students, you know that we have a summer APEX program. And so for my APEX, I worked in Sri Lanka. And I had already taken your class, you might not remember this, but I sent an email, and I was new to academia, and I was like, oh my gosh, this group is doing amazing work, but they could really benefit from your slides. And I was like, is it okay if I share them? And I didn't know. You know a lot of things about academics being territorial and all of those things. And you, A, wrote back to me, which thank you. And then B, just wrote back, of course. You're like, that's what it's for. And that spirit of sharing and just pure participation and community partnership has been so beautiful. And so I just wanted to take the opportunity to share that while I had the mic. So anyway, for a formal introduction, Dr. Mike Wessells is a professor emeritus of the program of Forced Migration and Health here at Columbia University. He is a longtime psychosocial and child protection practitioner, and I'm not going to read everything, don't worry, but just flagging a few things. So he co-chaired the global task force that produced the IASC guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings for students in the room. It's required reading for many of your classes. He also authored the Child Soldiers from Violence to Protection, and has conducted extensive research in many different places. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Mike. he's going to speak for a bit. Then we're going to come back and have a panel. And then after that, please stay if you're in person. Sorry, webinar guests, but we are going to have snacks and a reception later. So will you join me in welcoming Dr. Mike Wessells?
The question is whether my mic is on. I think it is. Okay, we're good. We're good to go. Almost.
Almost.
There we are. Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here. We're meeting at a really strange time. I mean, I think it's obvious to everyone here that the humanitarian system is facing an unprecedented crisis. It's true that we have some of the deepest funding cuts to deal with in history at precisely the moment when there's a very sharp spike in needs. I mean, it's kind of like the convergence of the worst two paths for human well-being that one could imagine. And part of me says, well, in this kind of climate, what are you doing talking about localization? You know, kind of a minor side bit. But I'd like to put a different spin on it. Crisis has always evoked struggle, new ideas, courage to change. And I want to maintain that, having been a humanitarian worker for most of my adult life, these are quantities that are in desperately short supply. The humanitarian system has been way too rigid. It has not achieved accountability and sustainability, much less efficiency, in meeting human needs in times of crisis. And it's actually a good time to step back and ask, are we getting it right? Even aside from the issue of funding, and I'm not at all saying put that aside. I'm just saying this is a moment when we always have to ask, are we getting it right? And I want to, I hope you don't go rushing for the doors, but the punchline is going to be that we've been failing the people we serve by not creating enough space for human agency. Human agency and capacities for problem solving and dealing with difficult situations actually thrive in difficult situations, but you'd never know it looking at the humanitarian enterprise, where too often it's about what external actors such as NGOs, UN, and governments do. So I'm going to try to argue that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, but we need to do our part towards bringing agency back to the center. Agency does not end at the border where you enter a zone of armed conflict. So what I'd like to do is to walk through a series of items that actually correspond to some of the chapters in the big report, which I won't bore you with. I figure you guys need a 180-page or whatever report like you need a hole in the head. But don't worry, there's an executive summary, and you've got this presentation. So hopefully it'll all come down in 20 minutes. And it will leave lots of questions unanswered, and that's good. We need to work with questions. Pat answers don't work in humanitarian settings. So these are the kinds of topics we'll take a look at. So localization, as you know, is a hot topic. It's hard to have it as a hot topic, in part because there's not even a coherent, agreed upon definition of what localization is. It's kind of a loose-knit collection of ideas, but there are some common threads that have emerged over the past 6 or 7 years. First, there's the concept of shifting power to local people. And defining what is local, of course, is shot through with difficulties, but basically, local people are not outsiders like me who go rushing in the midst of a crisis. It's not the external agency that I work with. And then from there, everything gets muddled and complex. Some people say, oh, governments are local actors. And I'm like, really? I know lots of people, living in desperate circumstances who think the government is the enemy. And they don't want people from the capital city with, highfalutin degrees and so on coming in and telling them what to do. But the idea is to shift power to local people, progressively transfer funding to local actors following the grand bargain and subsequent developments, and thereby reduce pressure on international systems. It's no secret that the international system has been unable to keep up with the increasing intensity, longevity, and frequency of the conflicts and disasters that are wrecking human well-being worldwide. But there are some problems with localization. I've already mentioned a couple. But one of them is that the discussions have focused rather narrowly on funding. So the idea is that that was cooked up at Geneva in New York in UN circles was to set a target for 20% or 25% of all funding to go to local actors. Could be governments, could be national NGOs or other actors. The problem I have with this is that money, of course, is important for people in desperate circumstances for all manner of reasons. But funding doesn't touch on very basic elements of autonomy, agency, and responsibility taking. It's entirely possible to have money gobbled up by a government, which then does things to and around or against communities that are against the wishes of the people. So there's lots of complexity when you focus only on money. The funding emphasis tends to privilege organizations and groups that have official registration. And as someone who works on child protection and on mental health and psychosocial well-being, I want to take a social ecological approach and say families and communities are among the most important supports for the healthy development and well-being of children worldwide. It's as true in conflict zones as it is in New York City today. And yet those are not typically officially registered entities in most countries. So I think that it's really way too narrow. And a lot of localization efforts have given money directly to governments. I'm not opposed to this, but I do want to note that in some cases, the government tends to look down at people who are relatively uneducated and who are of a different social class, and to think that somehow they don't know what's good for them, so it's our job to tell them what to do. So there's a very patronizing attitude, and one that diminishes agency rather than increases agency, and that is really unfortunate. So the dominant currency facing problems such as these, just a short smorgasbord of some of the main kinds of problems in child protection, from gender-based violence to loss, disability, trafficking, child recruitment, and so on, is that when you look at how humanitarian work is done, it's overwhelmingly following an expert-led process. And I'm not setting myself apart from this, even though it's something that I think is too narrow to be a one-size-fits-all. But I did this approach for over 25 years, so I can claim to have some familiarity with its strengths and its limits. But some of the limits, I think, are pretty obvious. First of all, outsiders hold the decision-making power. We are hired by NGOs or by UN agencies and asked to go in and conduct a situation analysis, a rapid assessment, and then render analyses and recommendations. These are the child protection problems that need to be addressed. And here are the interventions that are indicated. And guess what? Those interventions almost always come from the global north. And I think it's no secret that a West is best approach marginalizes local understandings, culture, values. And furthermore, Western interventions, even though they can be tremendously useful, I'm not at all an opponent of them, but they tend, when they're imposed, they tend to be decontextualized. And when they don't fit the local context, people don't use them. They tend to be relatively ineffective or seem to be alien, and uptake is typically very, very low. Local people are regarded by many humanitarian workers and by NGOs as victims, as survivors. Oftentimes they're called, and I hear this a lot at board meetings, beneficiaries. Well, hogwash. They're human beings. They're human beings faced with difficult circumstances. It's not like they have no agency and have no ideas. In fact, they may have a much deeper understanding of their situation and what their immediate needs are and what might actually work in addressing those needs. So I would argue, rather than having an expert mentality, we should adopt a student mentality, as in, I'm here to learn with you alongside. And that co-learning approach, I think, is one that sits poorly with an expert mindset. There's, in the current system, little emphasis on local agency. It's understood that experts have the expertise. The view is that local people have been knocked down or disorganized, and they don't have the wherewithal to design the things that might work best. There's lots of concern about harmful traditional practices, so-called. Maybe we'll get to that a bit later. But at the end of the day, what happens is the programs get branded as, oh, this is a Save the Children program, or this is a War Child Netherlands, War Child Holland project. It's not viewed as something owned and run by local people. It tends to be less effective, and it tends to be less sustainable as a result. So when you mute agency, you reduce ownership, and you introduce problems that impose much greater limitation than we ought to be willing to accept. And worst of all, maybe, we create dependencies. So lots of times people say, gee, are you going to continue this work when the external funding is done? And they may have good intentions and say yes, but you go back 6 months later and nothing is happening. It all falls apart. And this is absolutely commonplace across the board, regardless of country and even regardless of sector in which you're working with. So I'm really not trying to say that, by the way, that expert-driven approaches have no place. They do. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. But I wanted to offer a different approach, one that complements and I think adds dimensionality to our toolkit. And it's one that puts communities at the center and says that groups of people, even under difficult circumstances, may be in a situation where, with appropriate facilitation from inside the group or from outside, can have dialogue, planning, and action that's owned and led by them. And so it goes under the name of a community-led child protection approach. It's inherently localized because power is devolved to a particular group of people. They might be living in a very difficult, temporary setting, a so-called squatters camp. They might be living in a peri-urban situation. They might be living in a straight-up refugee camp. There are any number of other settings that this may apply to. But the idea is that the local people themselves decide what are the key issues, which ones to address. They decide which interventions or which actions designed by them to implement. And they may choose to bring in outside elements, but the point is they choose that. It's not imposed on them from outside. And then they take collective action, and as they go, they periodically step back, reflect, identify challenges, successes, any needed adjustments, and they take corrective action. So there's a lot of, I think you can see autonomy, agency, and dignity under these difficult local circumstances. And the bottom line is that it is the affected people who take responsibility for their children's well-being. They're not looking to someone from Columbia University. They're not looking to the UN. They're not even looking to their government. They're looking inward at themselves. And this is the essence of community. We're a network of people with common values. We care about our children. We knit relationships so that we can help each other. And they help each other. And they learn together. And so in this view, the role of the outsider is more as a facilitator, maybe a co-learner who learns with, not just about, and who documents and tries to bring some of the successes of local action to the attention of other groups so that different groups can learn from each other. So what animates the approach is collective caring. It all begins with understanding children's situation and really being motivated to address the problems that children are facing. And then the community out of that feels a sense of responsibility. They take responsibility. And so this is an internally motivated action. It's not an action wherein outsiders empower the communities. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Communities empower themselves. And they empower it through their own courage, their own ability to take stock of their difficult situation, their imagination, coming up with ideas for how to take action, and to be accountable. And the accountability is the thing that has been missing most, I would argue, because the current situation with expert-led approaches emphasizes external accountability. But this is about internal accountability. Community members ask, are we doing what's best for children? Are we succeeding in addressing these things that girls and boys have told us about? Where are we? So when it happens, well, it is a bit of magic. Okay, so to try to learn more about community-led approaches, under the Interagency Learning Initiative for a period of about 10 years, and then continuing after that, I had the honor of leading a very gifted team of people, most of whom were from the 3 countries that were mentioned before, Sierra Leone, Kenya, and India. And my position was not that of some special guru or person who had the vision to do everything. It was actually quite the contrary. I was simply a collaborator in a co-learning process. And the idea was to have lots of ideas bubble up organically from conflict-affected and people affected by different kinds of severe needs. We used a mixed methods approach because we felt passionately that there was so much that we don't know. I'm not at all opposed to numerical approaches. I actually like quantitative analyses, but there's a problem. When you do quantitative analyses and questionnaires, you presume that you know what's most important. The better approach to take is to admit to yourself, I don't know what I don't know. I don't even know what are the questions that are most important for this particular group of human beings. So why don't I take time and listen, learn, ask questions, have them teach me. And when one works in this way, I can guarantee that it's not only eye-opening and jaw-dropping, it's life-changing. Because you begin to understand that, oh my gosh, coming in with a Convention on the Rights of the Child approach and a strong human rights orientation, I'm almost programmed to overlook all of these things that are so important to people, given their own local understandings, idioms of distress, and so on. We work with national researchers, and we tended not to favor people who had lots of education. We chose people who had excellent skills of deep listening, who could really hear what people said, who didn't try to summarize in 2 words what people said, but who thought every word was so important they would capture it verbatim and then translate it. They spoke local languages, not the colonial languages that were tended to be dominant. And we did lots and lots of training and reflecting to help them get to the point where they weren't inserting themselves, but evoking and really listening. So we spent a lot of time building trust with local communities. And just as a footnote, we didn't go driving in big automobiles. We never showed up in coats and fancy clothes. We always came in on motorbikes or small cars of the kind that were used in the community. We spent lots of time sitting and having meals with people, sitting under the tree, as they say in Sierra Leone, hanging heads, and having discussions about the state of things. And we didn't come in as an NGO deliberately. When you do that, there's the expectation of money, and that tends to elicit a lot of game playing and sets that power asymmetry that we talked about. And so we wanted to avoid that. Then we used a process of rapid ethnography to try to learn in a highly elicitive approach and a fun approach about children, what it meant for a child to be well, what were the things that caused harm to children, and what people would naturally do about it. And so with children, for example, we played a game called body mapping. Some of you may have used this. It doesn't sound quite right, But basically, you can get a group, let's say, of 10 boys or 10 girls, maybe in the age range 6 to 10, and the girls might draw an outline of a girl and give her a name. Maybe they'll dress her up and have fun, talking about her and talking about her imagined family life. And then you'll ask a question. What do the girl's eyes see that she likes? Oh, they'll get all excited. Oh, the girl sees her mother coming home and she's really, really happy. What do the eyes see that they don't like? Oh, they see the father hitting the mother. She doesn't like that. So you begin learning not about the traumas of particular children, but what are some of the kinds of things that populate the social environment, for children. And we did a lot of group discussions, a lot of individual discussions, and a lot of participant observation. And participant observation is particularly important in getting beyond the words, because sometimes we all romance ourselves with our own narratives, and sometimes our behavior contradicts those narratives. And so I think that too has a really important point. Following that, there's a prolonged period, typically about as much as several months, where the community decides which issues to address. And a facilitator, in a non-directive way, asks questions such as, how does the community take a decision about which issue it wants to address? And people will say, oh, we have a big meeting and everybody makes a decision. I saw a blind girl over there. Is that right? Yes, there's a blind girl who lives in that hut. Does she go to the meetings? Well, no. And if there's a girl who's been sexually abused, can she speak in a community? Oh, no, she would never speak up in the whole community. That would be disrespectful. So people begin reflecting, and they start asking themselves, what would it take to hear inputs from the blind girl? How could we include inputs from the girl who was traumatized without singling her out and without talking about her individual suffering and so on? And what this does over time is it creates a highly inclusive process where typically there are small group discussions, home visits for people who don't come to the big meetings and so on. It's really quite wonderful. So the term community refers to the whole community, not just to the leaders, not just to the men who typically in patriarchal societies lead or even just make the decisions for everyone. And the big thing is that children have a voice. If you wanted to take notes on one thing, that would be it. Children usually don't have a voice about the events that are most significant in their own lives. This is true in our society as it is in many others, but it's more true in many others that have a strong emphasis on respect for and obedience to adults. So the community decides which issues to address. They then set about deciding how to address it, so they engage in action planning. And they don't ask for interventions from big NGOs. They ask, what can we do? So the emphasis is on their own resources, their own imaginations, their own in-depth understanding of the context, and their own caring for their children. They take community action, and then periodically they step back and reflect and continue. And I just realized I'm talking too much and have stepped over time. So rather than go through in-depth case studies, I'll just mention very briefly that in Kenya, the communities decided to address, quote, early sex, which was a mixture of forced sex and sexual exploitation. Oftentimes, girls didn't have money to go to school, so the boda, the motorbike drivers, would give them rides and they'd give sex in exchange. Same was true for sanitary pads and for food, which both were in short supply. The community decided to address these issues with the girls' leadership, but with the boys acquiescing too, on playing football, but with lots of discussions designed to take stock of what were their life goals. What did they want in their lives? What kinds of values did they want to have? Many of the girls said, we want to continue education. So they said, football will keep us from idling and getting in trouble, but also we'll support each other for figuring out how we can stay in school. And girls needed to learn how to say no to unwanted sex, sexual advances. So these life skills were actually quite important. So the girls and boys both engaged in these kinds of activities with parents also leading discussions on how to be better parents. And over a period of a couple of years of intervention, we saw reductions in early sex, increased education participation, improved parent-child relations, not from the standpoint so much of the parents, but through the voice of the children. They said, my parents never listened to me before. I never had any input when the family was making a decision. Now I do. And girls commented very explicitly that their status was improved. They said, now I can go to school. Secondary school was a very big deal. And there were high levels of community ownership, and that boded well for sustainability. So with that, I'd like to stop, and we're going to have a 5-minute input from my dear colleague, Ken Ondoro, who is the national leader of the work in Kenya. And he will say it far better than I can.
Great, so thank you. My name is Ken Ondoro. I was the national lead in the community-led child protection mechanisms work that we did in Kenya, and more specifically in the coastal area of Kenya, county called Kilifi County. I'd like to speak about 2 subjects here. One, the spontaneous spread of the community-led process, and secondly, I'll speak about ownership. So let me start with the spontaneous spread of community-led process. So what happened is that first and foremost, the community where the activities were taking place is very close to the other neighboring 20 or so communities. And so while these activities were going on, they kept on inviting the other neighboring communities. And other than being invited, the other neighboring communities were also observing and crossing over the borders and coming and joining the community where the activities were taking place. So through that, they started learning what these communities were doing, and they also went back into their own villages and started doing the same. Secondly, girls and boys felt that they had learned so much that they wanted to share with the neighboring communities. So they started by literally walking very long distance to the neighboring communities, sharing the information with other girls, sharing the activities that they are doing with the other girls, and also encouraging them to do the same activities or do something that would also help in building their agency. So that kept spreading over time through observations, through interactions of the girls and boys. But most importantly, the parents also felt that they had done so much work in their own village, and they had tried so hard to keep their children safe. And they felt that if they hold on to that and do not spread whatever they had learned to the other communities, then their children still stand at risk, because the neighboring communities, all these neighboring communities interacted a lot. And so as a group of parents, they also started moving into the neighboring communities, sharing with them what they have learned, sharing with them the activities that they were doing. And slowly by slowly, the neighboring communities also picked up. In terms of ownership, I think from onset, this process put the community members, or rather put the community at the forefront. And so we came in as facilitators. We didn't came in as project officers or project implementers. And discussing about the harms and settling on the harms to intervene on and coming up with the activities, all that were led by the community. So it came from the community, it was led by the community. They came up with the activities. They came up with the structure of the activities on how they are going to do the activities. Girls came up with their own activities, boys the same, parents also had their own activities. Through that, it was not an external thing, but rather it was something that came from the heart of the community and from the heart of the people of the community. So these activities were embedded in communities' everyday lives. They were not running parallel to communities' everyday lives and activities. So that then became part and parcel of the community, and something interesting to share is that to date, or as early as last week, I still keep getting feedback and communication from these communities. They're sharing with me the girls went for a football tournament. They have recruited 2 new football teams for the girls. The boys have recruited 2 new football teams for the boys, for the younger boys. Parents are still having meetings and discussions. And by the way, they are still engaging the neighboring communities. I haven't been there in quite a long time, but I have evidence to show that these communities still reach out to me. They share with me. They feel I'm their friend, still part and parcel of them. So they send me pictures. They share with me the milestones. For example, the communities got together, fundraised for one of the children to proceed to secondary school. And most of those funds came from the chicken business keeping and chicken rearing and sales business that they started. It's still up and running. So it's great to see how when the community owns the process and embed it in their everyday lives and everyday activities, it doesn't become an external thing. It becomes part and parcel of them. And I think that has sustained the momentum to date. Thank you.
So the spread of the I hope that's better. Sorry. So the vertical scale up in Sierra Leone is continuing as we speak. I'm almost out of time, so I'll be very quick. And I can't seem to advance this now. Oh, here we go. I wanted to mention, though, that when we think about ownership, we're not thinking about a single homogeneous entity. We're thinking about a cycle that builds and repeats over time. It starts with internal caring and responsibility taking that generates agency and decision-making by local people, who then engage in self-reliant action and, importantly, engage in self-accountability. So if you want true accountability, this is one method for developing it. I do not hold it up as the greatest method ever or the only way to do it, but it is far better than the kind of external accountability that the humanitarian system typically achieves. The 3 country findings are all outlined in the report, so I'm going to skip over this, but the high levels of ownership and the high levels of effectiveness are very discernible. And I'm going to jump ahead and just mention that this, of course, is not a one-size-fits-all approach. If tomorrow there were hundreds of thousands of people in South Sudan pouring out of the country, their situation is a plight that is beyond words, as is the situation in Gaza, I would not recommend using a community-led approach. It's not the time for that. You know, when people don't have basic needs being met, you have to use an expert-led approach. So I'm not an opponent of expert-led approaches at all. My problem is that expert-led approaches have become a one-size-fits-all when there is no one-size-fits-all. So where things are a little more stable, where there is a group of people who can talk and plan and act, that's when we ought to be using more of a community-led approach. And these two are complementary. Communities cannot deal with the specialized care that is the entitlement and right of every human being who's been wounded or tragically abused. And nor can an expert-driven, responsive approach have the prevention power that a community-led approach has. So I'm arguing for putting these together in complementary ways. So the report ends with recommendations for donors, which really won't surprise you. More flexible, longer-term funding, simplifying enlightened requirements for reporting and grant administration and so on, and shift power, not only the power to create actions and to achieve children's well-being, but power in the form of knowledge. Knowledge is power. And this is one of our roles. Maybe we can play a role in trying to document and then help share what communities teach us and what they teach each other. And that could be something that, that might be quite helpful. And then recommendations for practice, enabling higher levels of ownership for me is key. Having used expert-led approaches for a couple of decades, I can say that they are definitely useful, and in some situations they achieve moderate levels of effectiveness. But they never achieve the level of ownership seen in community-led processes, because it comes from the people. It's an extension of their own agency, their own creativity, their own dynamism, and understanding of the context. So I hope that as we move forward, there will be more attention to using community-led approaches and to making children's voices and lived experiences very conspicuous within them. So for the full report, you can go to the childprotectionforum.org website, and it also has a couple of briefing papers, one for donors and one for practitioners, and I hope that will be useful. There are also a whole set of tools, training tools, ethnographic learning tools, and facilitation tools on the childprotectionforum.org website. And I'm going to end there. I'm sorry I went over time, but I hope that in some way in your own work, you too will be able to support, learn from, and advance human agency in times of crisis. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We're going to transition now to a panel. If you see folks moving, that's because we co-located this in a classroom. So students, if you need to leave, this is the perfect time. Thanks. So I'd like to ask our panelists to come up, and perhaps first you could take a seat. Mike? And I will introduce you while we switch. For our webinar friends, we're going to switch the screens and things like that.
Yes.
So first, I will introduce one of our panelists, Dr. Arturo Harker Roa. He received his PhD in economics from the University of California, UCLA, and is currently the director of Imagina, an applied research center at the Universidad de los Andes that produces and disseminates evidence for the design and implementation of interventions, strategies, and public policies that promote the well-being of children and youth. And this is one of the 3 core research partners I alluded to earlier for those who are newer to CPC. So thank you for being here with us. To his left, we have, or right, I always say that wrong, to his right, we have Dr. Elen Costigan. Dang it, I tried so hard. Costigan. Yes. Who has over 2 decades of experience working in humanitarian action and public health, and completed recently a doctorate in public health from Mailman. So really excited to have you here. Her career also includes working with MSF or Doctors Without Borders since 2010 in over 20 different countries across Latin America and Africa in various different emergency settings. And all of her work really focuses on community engagement, and then through that work and through many other things was elected to be part of the board of MSF. And then finally, we have our facilitator, Claire Cunningham, who is a current student in the Department of PopFam and also works very closely with us here at CPC. So take it away.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me? I'm just going to take that from you, Sabrina. No worries. Well, I want to thank you all for being here and joining us. Thank you, Mike, so much for that talk. That was, I know 180 pages in 20 minutes is nearly an impossible task, but it was, I know that everyone in here was grateful to hear from you. So we just heard from Dr. Wessells about how they use community-led approaches to shift power and strengthen localization and ownership in your child protection work. So Drs. Harker and Costigan, I'd like to give each of you a few minutes to share a bit about your work and how you've incorporated approaches to promote leadership and participation of communities into this work.
Great, thanks. You know, I thank you for all being here and thank you for everybody joining online. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here with all of you and, you know, with Dr. Wessells, right? It's just a treat. This is my first time seeing him present in person because I did my doctorate all online, so incredible. Those in the room, it's a great treat. And thank you. So my work, yes, I started out working with civil society organizations. So I started out working with smaller organizations, right? And getting a sense of the power dynamics and how, you know, they have a certain role, how they're looking for funding, you know, and then, you know, seeing the bigger players like the MSFs and the big humanitarian organizations and how those relationships work. And then in 2010, when I started working with Doctors Without Borders, I first started out in logistics, realized I'm not great at that role, but I ended up taking on roles in community engagement and somewhat resisted climbing a ladder of more responsibility because I really fell in love and developed a deeper passion for that community engagement work, which is so important, right? I'll just say a lot of the comments on that side, there's so much wisdom and knowledge condensed in those few slides. So, you know, hopefully people take note of that and paid attention while Dr. Wessells was speaking, because it is so important. And I think a lot of organizations that do important work still have a lot to learn. I think we've made a lot of strides, but it's very important to continuously improve and try to really think about, you know, what is the relationship with community members, you know, individuals and communities as a whole, and how are we engaging and interacting to make sure that, you know, it's appropriate, the interventions, you know, it's fit for that context, as, you know, Dr. Russell said, not one size fits all, and then sustainable, right? So it's not going to be a helicopter in and out and what was left behind, but really thinking about, you know, how durable, you know, the impact of that work is going to be. So we'll have more questions to dig into it more, but this work is extremely important at an organizational level, you know, at a systems level, and it's important to have that in mind as we're thinking about, you know, going into the workforce. So thanks.
So I'm very, very happy to be here, very honored to be with you in this panel. So in my experience was a little bit weird. I'm an economist. I did my PhD. I went back to Colombia with a new and sincere interest in early childhood development because my first boy was going to be born. So I was reading about that stages of life and the importance. And I went back to my country. I've lived there forever. To face the obvious fact that like most of the children there didn't have the basic needs met to reach their amazing potential, given the amount of violence and extreme poverty that is like prevalent over there. So with a colleague, we started looking on how to pitch in. No, we were very, very far from being prepared to face this kinds of challenge of thinking on creating a program or going into an intervention area. We were researchers that we knew about quantitative methods, impact evaluation, very far away from the field. Thankfully, we found a team, Lisa Lieberman and an applied psychiatrist and psychologist from UC San Francisco, which was like dedicated her whole career around how to help families and children thrive in a context of forced displacement so we started working on that, and moving fast forward, we learned tons of things which you mentioned, and now like reading the report and the reflections, we need like an extra mile to get to community-led, not community-based, which is, it makes a big difference. And what I'm feeling is if we have like hopefully the void of international aid hasn't affected that program. It's called Semillas de Apego. We did our first big intervention in Tumaco, where you visited in Colombia, a very beautiful place, but with a lot of challenges. We have funding, but if it didn't go, like we haven't done the complete job. But we found out things that are amazing. We went the right way of basing the whole intervention on mothers and fathers that became community agents, that did and led all of the intervention, the curriculum. But still, we had this, I don't know that's probably how we were programmed, that we needed to have control on that the curriculum was met. The development of the curriculum, it has a big like a space for the curriculum to be adapted and appropriated. And for instance, in Tumaco, there were a lot of body activities to engage and to, but they were based on yoga. No? They came from California, and in Tumaco people dance and sing. And so that happened. We have the space, things changed. We integrated the local music, but at the end of the day, the objectives of the program were prescribed. And we see that it works, but we wouldn't, my guess is that if we had zero money to keep that work going, that would progress to another thing, which is great, but it would be different. So it's very encouraging to get a voice of like deep knowledge of, don't worry, people know what they need and they're going to continue. But it's a shame, like I'm missing an opportunity of getting that leadership potentialized and that they understand. You see sprouts of that happening, especially in the pandemic. We saw that our community, that our team kept moving, but we haven't explicitly worked towards that target. So that's my reflection. We did some community-based, and it's in the DNA of that program, but it hasn't been a target. And I think that's a missed opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you. I have my little one. I forgot about it earlier. So I think we've been hearing things of, as Dr. Wessells highlighted in his lecture, of like ingrained responsibility and accountability in communities. But as you just brought up, Dr. Harker, there are certainly larger barriers that need to be addressed to promote this type of community-led work. So in your experiences and expertise, what are some of the systemic or structural changes that are needed in the humanitarian and development architecture to enable that true localization?
I wasn't gonna. I'll say one of the things that working in community engagement with organizations that might maybe have a lot to improve on in terms of true community engagement. One of the things, and Dr. Wessells mentioned this, is a culture, right, an attitude, a kind of humbling yourself, or just really this idea of the expert. We know what's right. At different times, I would find myself frustrated, right, with this idea of this it might not have been a realization of a one size fits all, but definitely at different times, this very top down way of thinking about things in different ways, not just funding, but at an organizational level, at different levels. So this is a really important thing to do, and I think it's an important time now to be reflecting on this, as a lot of our systems are and the way we're working are being upended, right? So we really have to reflect. In chaos there's opportunity. So there's quite a lot of wisdom in this room, but that's definitely one of these obstacles, is a kind of cultural mindset shift for people working in this space.
Thanks, Ellen. That was beautifully said. I wanted to come back to these issues of power. The humanitarian system has many vestiges of coloniality, and it's something that is very demeaning to local people. It probably contains more than a couple of ounces of racism, and it is, I would say, quite toxic to dignity, which is the highest priority. Right up there with saving lives in an emergency. But the problem is not just the decision making, but it's like the entire system is driven by white people, mostly white people from the global north, some, with the white man's burden kind of complex, some with really good intentions of wanting to help from a human rights standpoint. But the fact is, when the power is concentrated in the hands of the few, and the few come from that colonially empowered group, it's a continuation of a form of oppression that cannot be allowed to stand. And I think that it's incumbent on all of us to think very carefully about how we position ourselves with regard to these issues. My view is that you don't have to become a decolonial theorist. You simply have to ask yourself, what are the power dynamics here? How is it that I am subtly privileged? I'll start with myself. I've never known a day of real hunger. I've never feared really for the life of my son or my wife. I've never, been countryless, stateless. I've never been imprisoned, detained, tortured. So, that alone should sort of give you a heads up that, I'm privileged by just any measure you can imagine. So I think that we need to take this seriously, but it goes way beyond who sets up the funding, who sets the priorities and strategies. That's all really important. But from a global health standpoint, there's another one that doesn't get much attention, and that is evidence-based practice, which I'm a huge fan of. Of course, we need an empirical approach and to go on the basis of what actually works on the basis of hard evidence. But a lot of the evidence is aimed at Western-based interventions. How hard do we actually work to get evidence around locally developed, locally constructed, things that come from the hearts and the creativity of affected people? Do we give equal diligence to trying to learn from those and help bring those to light and make those things that other communities might want to learn from and take into account? I can count practically on one hand, the initiatives that I see. And when you talk with people from the global south in an atmosphere of deep trust, almost everyone will at some point say, we're not at the table in a deep way. This is just not acceptable. So I think that, this is a moment when low-cost, community-led approaches can be used more widely, but we can take the humbler approach of becoming students maybe, and listening and learning. And then another big structural factor is the politicization of aid. And we may not have time to get into that, but I did want to name it because of Gaza. South Sudan and others. It is a bigger issue right now than I think it has been in the past, and certainly with regard to U.S. humanitarian work, if that is not an oxymoron. But I think that's something that really requires our deepest commitment to changing and correcting. So thanks.
Yeah, maybe I can add a local issue that happens in this, and I'm connecting this what would you mentioned with the scale up, the vertical scale up of these kinds of interventions. So in Colombia, the whole system that provides services to early childhood is, and many services, is through local operators, like local NGOs, local community associations, local, for instance, in child care, local mothers that service the community. It's like in paper, it's great, and it's we have a nice thing going there, but then the accountability, because we worry about accountability, guidelines, safeguarding, and many things that have to be there. There's this contradiction, because then these local organizations, and I've seen that in the ground, and it's a common, the joint voices like Rise Up, swamp their capacity to do things and to provide quality services, because they're dealing with paperwork, they're dealing with that. So it's something that we haven't worked through. That is like an institutional barrier by design of not being able to really have mechanisms to let the community lead and have especially internal accountability. That is, I think that's there's a big void on the side of the systems. Like on your responsibility must be to make this internal accountability have a way of working. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And to that, Dr. Harker, in your work, this type of scale up or sustainment of these programs after funding ends, what are some of the strategies we can build into our programs to ensure sustainability of our initiatives and goals?
So I think it's difficult when you're on the position of just being like the technical advisor to an NGO, or in an NGO, or to have the vision of, okay, as soon as we start planning whatever we're doing, we have to start talking to the government, and exploring what are going to be the scale up and scale out routes. But it takes time, because it's shifting public policy. So it is about political support. It is about legal viability of things. For instance, in providing mental health services. In Colombia, there's a very strict law that says that only clinicians and in clinical venues prepared for that, you can provide that kind of services. Psychosocial support you can do, because that's different, and we don't know that gray area. So at the end of the day, we're promising that we're going to deal with anxiety, depression, all that, but through psychosocial support, because legally, you're legally at risk if you say that you're doing mental health work. And tied to the issue that you need then to have psychologists or psychiatrists doing that work, which is completely out of the question in Colombia. It's impossible. We don't have the professionals. We won't have the professionals. Probably it's not even what we really need. No, it's but then, so there's these are long-term discussions that when the funding ends, and you're like, okay, so let's go and talk to the mayor's office if they want to take this program, and the mayor's office doesn't even know the program. They don't have buy-in. It's not theirs. So that's why, yeah, it's like having that from time -2 start working on it. Yeah.
Any comments?
How?
Yeah, I think getting deep ownership is the best way to get accountability and sustainability. And the way to do that is just create enough space and room and time so that communities can weave their own agency into it and their own creativity. But governments, you're exactly right, typically don't want to have to deal with all that. So I'm not an opponent of governments generally, although some governments I'm a very strong opponent of. But civil society needs strengthening worldwide. And my advice is, if you want sustainability and if you want human rights, don't look to governments alone. Governments can't do everything. Most children in New York City grow up, even with a surfeit of social workers, psychiatrists, and psychologists, and they never see one of those. And there are cases where a child should see them. But I think there's something, missing in this idea that somehow it's the specialists who do all this. The best psychosocial care comes from a loving parent, a loving family member, a caring peer. I mean, this is something that can't be matched by a therapist. On the other hand, if someone is profoundly affected and overwhelmed, you need the intervention of a specialist. But so often we look to governments to implement sustainability. I'd like to turn that around a little bit and say what we need is stronger civil society, because for one thing, governments politicize aid and they politicize human well-being. We see it in so many societies around the globe. It takes the people who have an eye, if they have an eye for human rights and for human well-being, they will make those governments more accountable. And civil society mechanisms are a vital complement to what governments can do. So I'm very much in agreement, Arturo, with your plea to help governments find a way, but also not to be overly reliant on them. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I want to touch back earlier when we were talking about the potential south to north exchange of learning and knowledge. Dr. Costigan, from your experience working in many different global settings and institutions, what mechanisms, to your experience, might facilitate this type of exchange in learning and knowledge?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And I'm just going to call out Dr. Wessells because I wrote on my notebook, create space. And I don't know if you were cheating. No, I'm kidding. But for this question, thinking about North to South and these dynamics, I think three things come to mind. One big thing is trust, right? And that's important at an organizational level, at a systems level, right? And I think Dr. Wessells was really speaking to this a lot, right? It's about building trust, it's about earning trust, right? And I think often some different external actors come assuming that they should be, right, trusted, and that's something that you earn, right? It's trusting your colleagues globally, right? This is something that I see, in different organizations where, people who might have certain credentials or expertise, right, maybe lack trust in their colleagues, right, who have different forms of knowledge, right, and experience, and that really cuts through this kind of helicopter mentality, right, or and it really emphasizes the importance of creating that space and listening. Another aspect I will talk about, and I'll just mention during my doctorate, and I'll just say, I finished my doctorate about a year ago, and it was such an incredible opportunity to take off the MSF vest and really look at things from a different vantage point. And we did a project that actually Dr. Wessells and Dr. Landers supported with my other DRPH colleagues. And we were doing qualitative consultations with different actors looking at how the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, affected these dynamics on decolonization, localization, in the humanitarian space. And one of the things we heard a lot from different people was that often what you have is delegation of responsibility without power, right? And I think that's a point that we are right now with a lot of different actors, right? And it's failing to, exactly as Dr. Wessells was saying, right, having things that are locally led and engaging communities at all parts of the implement of the cycle of interventions, and not just seeing people as implementers, right? So that's very important. And then a third thing that I think is very important to think about is also just being open to new ways, different ways of working, right? And this is something that, regardless of, that people in this room, people want to, it's important to think about that, and also think about as you're maybe entering a workforce where people might have a lot of experience and time working in this space, but also might have a lot to learn, right? And so also trust in yourself, right? Think critically, think openly, and listen, because, we still have a lot of progress to make in trying to grapple with these things. But I'm hopeful that, moving forward as, public health professionals, as, people working in the humanitarian space, we're able to work better and work differently.
Thank you so much. I want to see if there are any comments online or any comments or questions from anyone in the room. I think we have a little bit of time.
We can go to the questions online if nobody in the room wants to. So we have a couple of questions, one of which, and this is functionally for the whole panel, so I'll take notes. But thinking a little bit more about the funding mechanism and thinking about what underpinned all of this great work. So how does one sort of prevent a skewered power dynamic if the money is still channeled through external facilitators? How are you really able to tackle that?
Thank you for that question. The answer is with difficulty. Everything about community-led work is difficult because community power dynamics are inherently complex. If there has been a good process defined as one in which every member of the community exercised their voice and their agency and felt satisfied that they were heard, they weren't excluded, people didn't listen to them and then promptly disregard. And they had inputs into defining what are the issues to be addressed, what's the best approach to address it, how do we implement, how do we actually organize the activities, and so on. Then that means, that's a good sign. It means that things are coming from the community itself. And there is always a bit of a negotiation that goes on. The fundraising that goes on is typically done by an outside group. In this case, the Child Resilience Alliance is the nonprofit organization that we created specifically for supporting this process. We try to keep it low level, not on Broadway, quiet, because we don't want it to be about us. It's about what the community does. But when the community needs money, if the community starts with money and says, we need to rebuild a school and we think we can do it for only $50,000, the facilitator is trained to invite lots of discussion. And there's lots of discussion about whether a school is actually the thing that's most needed. Has there been adequate input from girls and boys and from marginalized members of the community? And so money becomes less the issue. But there is a point at which money becomes the issue. So people may say, for example, that girls are really serious about wanting to go to secondary school, but they cannot afford the uniforms that are required, and or they cannot afford the transportation fee or whatever it is. And so at that point, the facilitator doesn't say, okay, we'll pay for it. The facilitator by that point has really receded into the background. And typically the community begins asking, what can we do to provide the funding? And if they don't, then the facilitator might step in and invite the community to think through what they could do to provide funding. And out of that typically comes, most communities these days are familiar with savings and loan, kinds of arrangements. And they'll start something that will enable a particular family to receive a loan or to receive a payment that will enable the girl to go to school. And then over time, that privilege will rotate to other families who are also in need. But the point is that it's the community that decides to do that. So at no point does a facilitator in a community-led process say, yes, we are going to fund this, or yet, it's really not like that. It comes from the community. But if the community makes totally unrealistic requests, then it's time to step back just a little bit and to have a dialogue. And the dialogues typically involve people in the community saying, we need to do things that are feasible. So for example, in India, one of the first rural, actually it's a peri-urban community that I encountered, was one in which everyone is by their own description an alcoholic. And 8-year-old girls and boys drink hot toddies. And I went out to have a discussion group with a group of boys, and they were happily passed out on a haystack. I'm not making this up. And people said, we really want to take this on, but it's too big. We would have to get government support. We'd have to stop those guys from selling the liquor. And that would mean they'd have to find an alternate means of employment. We'd have to have a lot of money. And so we want to focus on something that's more feasible. Well, bingo. And isn't this the same thing that families do? We'd like to do X, but we don't have the wherewithal at this point. Maybe we'll aim for that longer term. So it's an intensive community discussion about what's feasible. And when the community can handle something, they do it. There are rare occasions in which we provide funding. It tends to be small seed funding of $5,000, in some cases not more than $10,000. And it's of the nature where girls and boys want to go to school, but the bathroom facilities, the sanitation facilities are unspeakably horrible. Girls are not safe. What would it take to rebuild that? And the communities put their heads together and they come up with a plan for rebuilding. And they say, we can do everything, but we can't get these materials. If we could just get those materials, we would do all the labor and all the repairs and things. So that's pretty much the way it works. So it's small funding, but it's guided by the communities, and the communities have the strongest hand in deciding which project, which action they will take. I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you so much. Any other comments or? Okay.
And I think it would be great to get, they're sharing the mic. Just on this, it's important to think about funding, but I also love, Dr. Wessells, that you said it's not just about funding, right? But it is important. One of the things that I found sometimes proposing projects like this is that people think that it's not serious, right? Because they say, by nature, it's going to be somewhat exploratory, right? And so if I've at different points spoken to people about doing this type of work, and they say, well, but how would you get funding for this if you don't know exactly what you're doing, right? But by nature, it shouldn't be fully baked, right? When you are actually engaging, you don't come with a plan of what you're going to implement. You're coming and listening and doing these things. So I think it's important to think about that from a funding perspective, and then, also, the other elements that are related to that, to make sure that, it's seen as actually legitimate, right? And not the opposite.
Thank you so much. Our question in the back, I believe.
Hi, Professor. My name is Nisha Achutan. I was formerly the executive head of the National Commission for Women in the Government of India, way back in the late 90s. I'm also a Columbia alum and now settled right here in the Columbia community. So this is part of the Ministry of Women and Child Development. I'm curious about the case study you mentioned relating to India. Can you recall approximately what years this was in and perhaps the location? Was it rural India or a slum in a big city? That would be helpful.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. It's an honor to have you with us. And it's fantastic that you're a Columbia alumnus as well. Thank you so much. The years for the work were 2015 to the present. At present, we have 3 Indian agencies: Chetna Vikas, SYNI, Children in Need Institute, and Praxis, which is one of the more participatory learning and research organizations in India. And formerly, Planned India was also part of the group. There were 2 interventions, 2 community actions that were done. One was in Kunti and was led by SYNI, and that was on school dropout. And that was a primarily rural tribal area. And the Pathalgiri movement made it impossible for some communities, some villages to participate. But I would say overall, the levels of participation were quite high, and they succeeded very well in reducing school dropout. Girls' participation in particular increased, and the girls and women said repeatedly that they had greater agency and were more respected in discussions, both in home and the villages. And in the Gram Sabha discussions, for example, the community village meetings, women often went, but they said, we speak and you can hear the yawns, you can just feel them. And they said, now that's not true. People know we have ideas, and some of the ideas happen to be very good ideas. In Dhanbad, where the areas were more peri-urban and were non-tribal, but had large migratory populations intermixed with a fairly stable host population, people chose to work on early marriage. And there was already a change beginning. Girls were saying, we want to marry whom we want to marry, not whom our parents dictate for us. And then also some parents were beginning to question whether it was a good thing for parents to choose. And so these dialogues really sped up the process, and they elected to work on child marriage, and they made a significant reduction in child marriage. And of course, that change is happening throughout India and really throughout the world through lots and lots of different organizations. But I'm happy to say that these changes occurred through the work of the communities. And now there's an effort, because we're in the era of Mission Vatsalya, where the Indian government has said, we really want the panchayat, the sort of larger panchayat might be a catchment area for 15 or 20 or even more villages. And it's like the People's Assembly, but it's still part of the formal government. The panchayat is to play a key role in child protection and in creating a friendly environment. And there's a mandate for the Gram Sabhas and for the traditional village meeting groups to pay more attention to children's well-being. So all this is now has the weight of a government mandate. But people are still trying to figure out, yeah, but how do you do this? Well, bingo, the communities that we've worked with have pioneered this. And they know how to change the Gram Sabhas. And the panchayats have some of the natural helpers who emerged in our villages also tended to be very involved at the Gram Panchayat level. And so now that work is being spread to other communities, and a lot of work is going on in Jharkhand, where we're doing the work. And it's being done with different state level organizations. There's an attempt to work with commissions at the central level, but there has been some pushback. I won't say that, they're doubting Thomases. It's more that there's an attachment to expert-led approaches in India, just as there's an attachment to expert-led approaches internationally. And it just takes time to change this. And one of the things that we've learned that's most powerful for change is to have people like me shut up. And seriously, when we want to have an impact, we don't have people with PhDs or whatever come in and talk. We bring the women. We bring the dynamic young leaders. We bring the elders. And they come in and they talk, and the policy leaders are listening. So I think that, I know that's an inadequate answer, but we are trying to link with the government. We're very, and it's incredible to see the creativity. So thank you, India. Thank you.
Okay, well, at that, I think we're at time. I want to thank each of you for being here. As a student, I don't want to speak on behalf of all my peers, but I'm going to, which is that I think to the point made at the beginning of the lecture today is that if the system might be broken and how do we fix it, it's very inspiring to be able to have the privilege and opportunity to speak with and hear from you. So thank you very much. Can I get a round of applause?
And thank you for our webinar friends. I'm just going to an event like this. First of all, the report was amazing and has so many people to thank, so please look at it. But also an event like this takes a lot of people to put on. So just a couple moments to say thank you. Claire Green, Cassie Landers, San Lau, Lucy Hillier, Yana Maevskaya, Tanvi is amazing, Maya, our students, Claire, thank you so much. And thank you, Mike, for continuing to challenge us. And I'm hoping at a university, we at least know how to keep that student mentality. So yeah, thank you so much. And for those in person, please do stay. We'll have some refreshments and snacks. And for those online, thank you so much for joining, especially those who stayed up late. Thanks.